So at the beginning of this section, we decided to protect the operations that modify data and make them available only to authenticated users. So let's go to our genres.js. Here's the post method for creating a new genre. This API endpoint should only be called by an authenticated user. So how can we enforce this? Well, here we did some logic like this. We need to read the request headers. So this request object has a method called header. Here we specify the name of the header, that is x-auth-token. We expect a JSON web token stored in this header. So we store this in this token. Now we want to validate this. If this is valid, then we give access to this API endpoint. Otherwise, we'll return a response like this. Response with a status code of 401, which means the client doesn't have the authentication credentials to access this resource. So this is the big picture. Now, we don't want to repeat this logic at the beginning of every route handler that modifies data. So we need to put this logic in a middleware function. Remember middleware functions? We talked about them in the section called Express Advanced Topics. So we put this logic in a middleware function, and then we can apply that function in route handlers that need to modify data. Let me show you. So let's cut this from here. All right, here we want to add a new folder called middleware. So we put all our middleware functions here. In this folder, we add a new file, auth.js. Now here we want to define a function called auth that takes 3 parameters: request, response, and next, which we use to pass control to the next middleware function in the request processing pipeline. If this concept sounds unfamiliar to you, you need to go back to the section called Express Advanced Topics, because there we explored middleware functions in detail. So here, in this function, we should implement this logic. We get the token. The chances are we don't have a token at all. In this case, we return a 401 response with a message like this: access denied, no token provided. So this helps the client to figure out why they cannot access this resource. Now, otherwise, there is a token. We need to verify that this is a valid token. So here we need to use our JSON web token module. So on the top, let's require JSON web token and store it in JWT. Now here we call JWT.verify. As the first argument, we pass the token. And as the second argument, we pass the private key for decoding this token. So we store that private key in an environment variable. We need to use the config module to read that. So require config and store it here. So just like before, we call config.get JWT private key. Okay. Now this verify method will verify our JSON web token. If it's valid, it will decode it and return the payload. So here we get the decoded payload. However, if this token is not valid, it will throw an exception. So we need to wrap this line with a try catch block. So try catch, we get an exception. If we get here, we want to tell the client that this is an invalid token. So response, we set the status to what? 400, because that is bad request, because what the client sends us doesn't have the right data. So send invalid token. Again, with this error message, we can troubleshoot the authentication issues. So if on the client we cannot access a given API endpoint, we look at the error message. Okay, we realize we sent an invalid token. Then we look at the logic on the client where we get the token and send it to the server. So this is our catch block. Now back to the try block. Here we have the payload. So we can put that in the request. So our request object, we add the user property to it, and we set that to this decoded. So earlier, we put only the ID of the user in the payload. Let me show you. So let's go to our user module. Here's our user schema. We added this generate authentication token method. We created a JSON web token, and this is our payload. So when we decode this JWT, this is the object we'll get. And we'll put this in the request as a user object. So in our route handlers, we can access request.user._ID and so on. Okay. So in the try block, we set request.user, and then we need to pass control to the next middleware function in the request processing pipeline. In this case, that's our route handler. So we call next. So as I told you before, in middleware functions, we either terminate the request response lifecycle or pass control to the next middleware function. Now, just a tiny issue in this code. In case we don't have a token, we're going to send this response to the client, but I want to make sure that we exit from this function. All right, we are done with our middleware function. Now at the end, we set module.exports to auth. Or a shortcut for that is to set it right here. So we set module.exports. We set it to a function. We don't need a name here. And then we can get rid of line 18.